Octant's mission is to create the first global self-sustaining ecosystem that both balances public goods funding and personal financial empowerment. So we believe that we need to both reward individuals and public goods projects.
Welcome to The Regeneration Will Be Funded. This is a show about regenerative finance. We are exploring pathways to a life-affirming economy. I'm your host, Matthew Monahan, and I'm joined today by Artem Brazhnikov. He's the head of technology and engineering at Octant. Artem, welcome to the show. Thanks for being here.
Hi, Matthew. Thanks for having me.
So maybe just starting a bit with your background and context coming into crypto, Web3, the projects you've been working on.
Yeah, I have been building software for the last 15 years. I started with cryptography and forensics, worked with VR and AI, and then approximately half of this 15 years, I have been working with crypto. So it got really interesting for me how a technology can exist that has this decentralized foundation that nobody owns and controls and can rewrite. And since I started my journey with a lot of cryptographic primitives, it was interesting to understand it. And once I understood it, I realized that it's not only a financial tool, it can be used for many, many different use cases. And so I went to the rabbit hole, learned all about it, and then started working on a number of projects, building Web3 protocols, development stacks, was working on a layer one. And then a couple of years ago, I went into the public goods funding rabbit hole.
Nice. And so that's when you joined Octant a couple of years ago?
Actually, I started exploring public goods space before that. So I looked in this space, different verticals, what's most interesting for me, how can I make the most impact? And this public goods and social impact space looked very compelling. And it was also around the time that Web3 social networks started appearing. So I looked at the dynamics of how people interact between each other in this space and thought how we can funnel this energy for good. So I just started experimenting with this tech, going to hackathons, building different prototypes, solutions, worked on a small project for a certain amount of time. And then a team from Octant reached out to me, and I felt like a perfect fit, and I started working there.
Awesome. So what is Octant? And maybe take us through the history of the organization or the project.
Octant is a public goods funding platform. It has renewable, sustainable funding stream. So what we're doing, essentially, we are staking 100,000 ETH in Ethereum consensus protocol. So it's in a way very similar to how people deposit money in a bank. But the difference is this is very transparent to get returns on the staking. When you deposit money in the bank, there's fixed or variable interest, but you don't know what's happening to the money. In terms of the staking mechanisms, you know what actually you're doing. You are securing the network by providing the capital. And also there are some risks involved with this, because if you're not participating well, then some of your capital can get slashed. But we found that this is a good way to support Ethereum ecosystem as a staker and also use the yield, the reward, the returns from the staking to fund public goods and impactful projects.
And where's the 100,000 ETH coming from?
So there was a successful fundraising event in 2016 that was pre-ICO era. So there was like a crowdfunding to build Golem network. The idea of the Golem network is to build generalized computer like AWS. One organization is still working on this. We are Golem Foundation, separate from this, and we decided to focus on more regenerative use cases for the community.
Got it. So essentially there was a successful fundraise. Those funds went into the foundation. What's the foundation called?
Golem Foundation.
Okay.
So there was a fundraise in 2016. The team has been working on this solution for like 4 or 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
There were some successes, highs and lows.
Mm-hmm.
And then part of the team decided to create Golden Foundation, take a part of this funding, and create more regenerative use cases and utility for the community.
Great. It's like a modern day foundation. Like, 100,000 ETH is $300 million equivalent right now. So that's a big endowment, big treasury. And then what you're saying is you're taking the interest each year, and that's going to public goods funding.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah. So we have the mechanism that generate this interest, and then it goes to public goods funding, mostly focused on Ethereum ecosystem, but we also have some public goods that benefit the whole internet, like privacy-oriented browser Tor.
Mm-hmm.
But also we created a mechanism design that rewards users for participation,
Mm-hmm.
and at the same time covers the operational costs for us running the infrastructure
Mm-hmm.
for Ethereum staking.
So yeah, I would love to dive in for the most part of our conversation around those mechanism designs and the grants programs and what you're building. But before we go there, I'm curious, like there are a number of projects that have raised a lot of funds over time that don't have foundations giving away funding for public goods now. Like what about the DNA or the structure or the incentives has led to this unique set of circumstances where, we have this huge pool of ETH spinning off yield going to public goods funding?
I think there are a couple of reasons. One is since most of the funds are in ETH and we have been a part of the Ethereum community, it makes sense to give back to the Ethereum community. So in part, it's very altruistic intention. From other point of view, usually if you look at the nation states, you have governments who take care of funding public goods. In Ethereum space, there is no such agent or system. Up until now, it was based on Ethereum Foundation funding or donation and new mechanisms. And so as we looking at the journey of Ethereum Foundation, we're thinking how long they will be able to fund the Ethereum ecosystem and community. And we think, how do we actually build a sustainable model for the future of Ethereum? And we are thinking generations, right? We're really thinking long term. And because we have all this system with on-chain protocols and mechanisms that funnel capital to different directions, we're thinking how we can actually use that to create the model to fund the ecosystem itself without relying on donations or purely human relationships going one-to-one and asking for money.
The Web3 space likes to use this term public goods, and it's a beautiful term, but it can sometimes be generously applied to the furtherance of aims for a particular type of ecosystem, a particular, project that has maybe more private ownership, capitalistic incentives, and just like, oh, public goods that support our ecosystem to support our token price. What I really appreciate and respect is like this feels true public goods, similar to Gitcoin in many ways, in terms of like, you're casting a very broad net in terms of what's qualifying. You mentioned the Tor browser, you mentioned Ethereum ecosystem, right? And those are pretty broad. And like you said, if we're building these new digital nations, these crypto networks, we need to also figure out how to fund all the things that nations fund. And yeah, we can't lose sight of that. Like, who pays for the roads, right? And so, I mean, what a beautiful gift and contribution to the ecosystem that Octant is providing by committing that much capital. I mean, a few $100 million that could be worth much more in the future, having all of that staking yield, which is just like, in the traditional finance world, that would just be like the interest from a bank account, like you said, or the dividend yields from company portfolio equities, et cetera. So yeah, just I guess starting with a full-throated endorsement of that core essence and spirit. I think it's really, really valuable.
Thank you very much. And we think this model can be replicated because we created and tested it. So it can be really expanded at larger scale. And when we talk about public goods,
Mm-hmm.
it's true that this term became very loaded recently.
Mm.
And since we're quite in nascent iteration of figuring out how do we fund public goods, impactful projects, how do we create these foundations for projects that don't have revenue streams or not necessarily commercially oriented, it's sometimes very hard to discern between them.
Mm.
And in our ecosystem, we have a lot of public goods, but also it has been a challenge for us to actually decide if we want to accept project X or Y into our round and essentially go through internal filtering and then community decides. But there are projects who apply and they claim that they provided impact in the public for like small group of people and therefore they can be considered a public good. So I guess this is a very larger conversation, but when we talk about public goods in the physical world, we can find examples and just start there. And some of the examples of public goods are roads, as you said, schools, hospitals, but also things like peace, right? And then that's obvious for people. Like when there is no peace in a country, then everybody loses. And so when we look at the digital infrastructure, it's quite new, but we see that some nation states start looking into this and creating ways to fund this because software is eating the world. And open source software and protocols like Ethereum and protocol upgrades for Ethereum are quite important because right now Ethereum secures billions and billions of dollars, and there are DeFi protocols and other projects that have sustainable revenue streams. We can think about them as businesses in a nation, but the foundation doesn't have sustainable model.
Right.
The foundation doesn't have the revenue stream. But if foundation is gone, none of those protocols can exist. And so we need to ask ourselves how we actually create those sustainable models. How do we connect this businesses running on top of the foundation and create a flourishing future for everybody? And this is a challenge, but we believe the key is in sustainability and creating bolder experiments, both in terms of funding larger public goods and funding smaller communities and how we combine that. And also an interesting term could be network goods, because if you think about these words, what they mean is there is a group of people, there's a network that benefit from a certain good, right? And then we can start reason about a small group of people, like a family. This is family goods, that's also a network. Then we have a community. They have something shared between them, right? They have some common goals and interests, and how do they fund things that matter to them? And then we start go beyond that. We talk about larger communities like Ethereum, a nation state, the world, beyond the world. So usually people who are closer to the source of funding, they benefit from it first. And so we need to find ways to create more fair ways to distribute this wealth.
Yeah, what's been happening in our nook of the space is a lot of people using the term nested scales, local land project scale, community, bioregional scale, broader, global scale, planetary scale. And a lot of the climate problems have different types of approaches and solutions at different scales. And the coordination at those scales looks different. The funding allocation mechanisms looks different. And so, yeah, like how we think about all that coordinative infrastructure and making sure that obviously the scales are nested in terms of that they can talk to one another and have good communication flows. Yeah, it seems to rhyme with some of the themes you're mentioning. So you've got this treasury, you're giving away the yield, but you've obviously been working deeply on what is the allocation tooling to decide, like who decides where that funds go? How do you decide? How do you track it? What is the software that supports this? So maybe, yeah, walk us through the past and the present and then where we're going.
Yeah. The short answer is the community decides where the fund goes. And when I say community, I mean the community who has been supportive of the Golem for a long time.
Mm.
And we created the software that allows people to essentially earn rewards in our app for just staking a token of the community. But they have a way to participate in the funding. And so you can think of this as a combination of a DeFi and refi space in a way, because people potentially can earn something like rewards, but the rewards are generated from staking, but they have a choice what they're going to do with those rewards. And so they can withdraw them and use it for whatever they want, or they can choose to donate all or part of it to fund public goods. And so what's interesting here is you can withdraw 90% of these rewards, but you can donate 10% and you can choose projects that are impactful. And the value that will be added to the project going to be much bigger than 10%. Because what is actually happening is you're moving the matching fund that is formed by this staking rewards from Golem Foundation Treasury. And so our usual matching fund in one round is around 350 ETH. And if we see that 10 or 20 ETH are donated from users, effectively those 10 and 20 ETH decide how the whole matching fund is distributed.
Got it.
And so the people who actually care about what's going to get funded, they have a voice in our system. And this is not a passive income, because we want people to come to our platform at least once in 3 months and express their opinion. And in the way the system works right now, the opinion could be, I want to take 100% home. But the opinion could be, I can donate 10% or 15% or 100%. But the key is to take an action.
Is the funding mechanism a quadratic funding mechanism?
Yes, it is.
Yeah. Okay. So what I hear you saying is essentially, just like you are taking a portion of your staking rewards or all of your staking rewards for validating the Ethereum network and earning your 3 to 4% yield today, you're taking that yield and moving it into public goods funding. You're essentially, there's a fractal of that, which is you're allowing individuals to stake their tokens. Is it ETH that they're staking and running validators, or this the Golem token?
It's a Golem token, yeah.
Yeah. So the Golem token holders are staking their earning yield, but you're making it easy for them to donate a portion or all or none of that staking yield into the public goods. And their votes, by putting their money where their mouth is unlocking the quadratic matching formula of where the larger pool of Octant's matching pool is going. So 300, 350 ETH each quarter, you said, or each 6 months?
Yeah, each quarter.
Quarter. So like $1 million every quarter is being decided by the community, by the Golem holders, by the Golem stakers. And there's this kind of shared incentive alignment because they have to actually put money where their mouth is to do that.
Yes, exactly. And it's all integrated in one holistic system. So it's not people coming with their donation and putting the money where their mouth is. Once they can withdraw they make decision over there. So it's both earning and rewarding
Mm-hmm.
in the same mechanism, and it can be expanded and replicated in the future in different ways.
Mm. What about all of these interactions makes it fundamentally it's not different from me earning 3% in a bank account and then taking my interest and then writing in my checkbook a check to Red Cross, donating, at the end of the year for my tax write-off, my interest from my Bank of America account. Like, why? What's different about this that makes it more sustainable, more likely that people are donating, et cetera?
I would say there are two parts to this. One is what is the tooling is used to generate this interest.
Mm.
And when we're talking about banking system, this is mostly closed system, and you don't really know how the funding being used and who and or what it serves for, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's one part of this. But taking that aside, if we're assuming that you can already take the interest from the bank and then you can just take and write a check to Red Cross, we think that it's quite important to make things easy for people.
Mm-hmm.
And also, we need to meet people where they are.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's much easier for somebody to make a donation at the moment where they can withdraw the funds and automatically make a decision. Okay, I'm going to donate 10%, I'm going to take 90%, and then I'm done. Right.
Right.
And if we think about this, like at the larger scale, we can replicate this model as people have the systems
Mm-hmm.
generating yield, and then people showing up to their application and their mobile phone
Mm-hmm.
once in a while and adjusting some parameters and then keep earning this, which makes
Right.
it easy because we have all these tools and smartphones and applications that people spend a lot of time on. And so if we find a way to communicate to people what's important and take an action once in a while, the probability that more funding will go to impactful projects becomes higher. So we need to actually integrate this into social networks,
Mm-hmm.
into other applications, and create the user experiences that people want to interact with.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's still an altruistic motive, but it's like so much faster and easier. Like the value proposition of my bank account giving me some interest and then taking that and then going over here and donating it. Like that happens. There's $1 trillion a year, whatever that goes into philanthropy and donations, right? That happens at scale. But if I can just do one click, one little knob in the same interface, that obviously is a huge unlock. And now you also, as Octant, have these matching pools, which gives this added incentive where it's like every dollar I donate could be unlocking $5, $10, $15 in matching for the causes I care about, which is a more compelling appeal than philanthropy's ever had. Like even the best matching campaigns, we've got a generous donor who will give $2 for every dollar you give, or $3, but like, no, this is like the quadratic is that times more.
Yes. And it is altruistic, but from other point of view, once you become more integrated into these communities like Ethereum,
Right.
you start actually understanding
Right.
that you are investing back in yourself because you want Ethereum to continue, you want builders to keep building the protocol,
Mm-hmm.
and there is a possibility to build a path between you putting 10% of your yield into these projects and then benefiting from this long term. It's like me future or us future thinking.
Right.
Right. And also, we are starting to think, how do we tap more into the capitalistic mindset? How do we find ways for people to think what are other potential rewards or games these people can play in order for these games to be more engaging, interesting, and fun?
Mm-hmm.
Because where we are is only the beginning. We are we proved the concept that this model works. The sustainable stream funds these projects.
Mm-hmm.
People donate and people decide how the matching is distributed. But there are more interesting ways to meet people where they are.
Mm-hmm.
And as I said before, it could be in social networks, right? Integrate the interface in where people spend time on.
Right.
If they have conversations there about public goods, it could be an interface that will allow you to have some kind of Octant widget that will allow you to make a choice to put this stream of funding into a certain direction, right? And we are
Mm-hmm.
seeing the mixture now between these social networks that mostly about
Mm-hmm.
writing, sharing your opinions, and transferring value. So we have seen some experiments in the space where this social aspect combined with financial tools.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's going to be even more in the future. In a way, we're freeing people from specific dogmatic financial tools.
Mm-hmm.
You can think about this as media. 100 years ago or 50 years ago, there were very specific media channels and people were watching only TV. Now, fast forward 50 years, and we have all kind of media channels, YouTube, and people can decide what kind of content they want to consume.
Mm-hmm.
So if you apply the same analogy to financial world, people will be able to use different mechanisms and systems in the future, and they don't necessarily need to go the same path through the bank and make one deposit and not really know what's happening to the money, and then how we actually can create better incentives
Mm-hmm.
to fund what's important for everybody and not for the small group of people.
Right. Yeah, love it. And I think part of that network goods that we've been really exploring in this show is just at the place-based network goods, right? Like the recognition, like you said, it's altruistic, but it's also the recognition that it's beneficial if the networks that you're a part of thrive. And one of those networks is your family, another network is your community and your local watershed. And I think rather than it being, just a philanthropic contribution to Red Cross at the end of the year, in the future, your local bioregional funding facilities will be in that same interface where you can kind of stake, restake, redistribute, quadratically vote, et cetera, in one click. And then those funds will essentially, pool into the appropriate places.
Yeah, exactly. And right now, mostly in the world, public goods funded through taxing.
Yep.
And in many cases, people don't really have a say.
Yep.
At the more granular level, how the funds are spent, we essentially trust the government to decide. And I believe there are better ways to do this. The government has been fulfilling this function for a certain amount of time.
Mm-hmm.
And as we create in all these tools, we can start building the better systems so people who care or want to participate can participate and apply this democratic principle to financial world. And in a way, the way government is doing can be done in more efficient way,
right,
in more transparent way, and add innovation to this. We can actually create much better system that benefit different communities, nation states, Ethereum community, etc.
Totally. Yeah. Sunlight is the best disinfectant. Like, think about what a transparent global ledger does for the current corruption of flows that happens within government spending. Like, it doesn't solve all the problems, but boy, it's going to make a huge difference. Yeah. So, how many funds have been distributed to date with these programs?
So Octant has been running for a year and a half now. We distributed around $6 million. We are trying to focus on smaller number of projects because they can actually sustain themselves a longer period of time, and they don't have to make trade-offs whether they need to take a gig and work on something that they don't really value, but keep working on their projects. A lot of grants, although they did a lot of good work in the space, provide like $5-10 to projects. And we are trying to really curate the number of projects we fund so they can keep making impact in the space.
Right. Yeah, we came to a similar conclusion with the Ma Earth grants rounds. When we talked to people who had been recipients of other Gitcoin rounds, one of the characteristics, intentional decisions was, a lot of Gitcoin rounds went really wide and let the community decide, here's the matching pool, let the community decide amongst legitimate projects where the funds go. But when you spread it out so thinly, then you get that dynamic where a project might have just spent a lot of time campaigning for their project in the 2-week round, and then they get $16 and they're like, was that really worth it? Right. And so when we were curating the Ma Earth grants rounds, we decided, the first round we did 23 projects, the second round we did 30, trying to kind of make a right relationship between the matching pool size and the number of participants so that the average contribution received would be meaningful enough to also warrant the onboarding into Web3 that we were requiring of them. And that has been positively received. And we learned in this most recent round that we probably should have had a minimum available because the distribution ended up being quite substantial in terms of the smallest recipient to the largest was like a bigger spread than we expected. And that's the purpose of running experiments and learning these things. So yeah, I really resonate with that. So you have the Golem stakers essentially quadratically voting and with their funds on capital allocations from the matching pools. But who or how are you doing that curation of those projects initially that participate?
So it's still an experiment. What we're doing is we allow people to apply. Every project can apply. There is a process that is described. They fill like certain forms, what they do, what they're focused on. Then we do internal curation, which means we exclude projects that are overfunded or funded by VCs or governments. So meaning they have enough to sustain themselves. Or if they are misaligned with our values, for example, the projects must be privacy preserving or open source. And then when we have a pool of projects that went through this curation process, then we run a community vote through Snapshot tool. And then 30 projects that on the top of that list, they get included into the next funding round.
Got it.
And when the funding round is happening, it's happening for 2 weeks. People vote and decide the distribution. And the interesting part of that game is people can change their mind anytime.
Oh, interesting.
So you don't necessarily need to just vote and that's it. That's only works for the nation's game. Because these funds are allocated and already in the system, you essentially have 2 weeks to decide how it's going to be distributed. And different people can change their mind and they see, I'm going to vote for this project. And then 1 week later, they can see, oh, actually, a lot of funding already goes to this project and I now want to support another project.
Interesting.
So it creates this dynamic. And if you imagine this visually, it creates this game between who gets more or less. And we have seen a lot of people changing their mind and closer to the end of this, we call allocation window, the decisions change.
Got it. How have the manipulation attacks been on these networks? And, like in the Gitcoin space, I hear they say, there's a very fine line between coordination and collusion. Obviously, you also have to have some sort of Sybil resistance or verification that people are submitting independent votes, and not just spinning up wallets. And take me through that stuff.
So actually, we went through a number of different experiments, and we didn't start with quadratic funding. We just started with classic linear voting. And in the third round, we saw one entity with substantial amount of capital locked changing the decision drastically.
Mhm.
And that's when we decided to switch to quadratic funding. Because these are all experiments, we wanted to see how this thing play out.
Mhm.
And so we saw that with quadratic funding, the distribution became, well, we could say better. And there's smaller attack vector, but we have a new attack vector. As you pointed out, there's a Sybil attacks, which means that people can try to collude or create a number of addresses
Mhm.
that vote for specific projects.
Mhm.
And so we have a number of defense systems, let's say. So we encoded that no project can receive more than certain percentage of the matching pool.
Mhm.
So even if somebody would be able to run extremely successful Sybil attack, they won't be able to take over everything.
Mhm.
And then we experimented with different Sybil resistant mechanisms that can be called something like proof of humanity or proof of uniqueness. Um, we saw small clusters of
Mhm.
people trying to vote for certain projects, and we exclude them for the next rounds.
Mhm.
From the next rounds, but we didn't have large scale attacks like Gitcoin so far.
Mhm.
Also, because another defense layer is the token,
Right.
and only people who are already in the system can vote. And if you want to create such a massive attack, you need to think like 90 days ahead, create all this addresses, distribute the funds between them, keep them for 90 days to get enough amount of rewards, because you don't get the same amount of rewards if you lock today
Mhm.
or if you locked 90 days ago,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, and I guess that rhymes with the pattern of economic security that underpins a lot of the blockchain defense systems, which is make it really expensive to attack.
Exactly.
Right? Like if it's too expensive, then you get rid of a lot of the bad acting.
Yeah.
Mm,
But the problem still exists in the space. It
yeah.
has not been solved. There are different approaches people experiment with.
Yeah.
And especially this problem will be more important at the larger scale.
Hmm.
And in general, the problem with quadratic funding that it requires people to be quite loud about what they do and amplify their voice, which not always benefits projects that don't have this social exposure, but they silently work on a project and keep building. And so we really looking forward to see more innovation in this space,
Hmm.
to find new ways to signal who actually needs to be rewarded for this.
Hmm.
And it can be funneled in a number of different ways. But up until now, I don't think we as Web3 found a solution to that.
Right. So you don't think it's like, yes, we have product market fit, off to the races, just keep iterating here. You think there's still some pretty fundamental innovation?
Oh, 100%. Yeah.
Mm.
I think quadratic funding allows us to put a price on a public good
Hmm.
and common good, and actually incentivize people to participate in this. But there are definitely this Sybil attack vectors and ability for people with significant social network outreach to turn attention to their project.
Hmm.
And if something on the top of the mind of people who make decision, they
Hmm.
will probably vote for something they know than for something they don't know.
Right.
That's why we need to find better ways to curate and fund projects that simply work and produce value,
Hmm.
but not necessarily loud about it.
Right. So just going a little deeper in both of those problems, the first being the Sybil attack. One other question on this kind of Sybil resistance is, how do you think about KYC and like, what I'm seeing, I'm guessing Octant's similar, but like we're using crypto addresses essentially as identity, um, you know, mechanisms, and that in and of itself is a design choice. And I know crypto is generally allergic to KYC, but do you see a world where this ends up moving into maybe ZK's KYCs, where we're you know, working on the Sybil resistance also because people are proving unique, or what WorldCoin's doing with scan your eyeballs, or like, yeah, how do you think about that space?
So I think there are always going to be attack vectors on the systems like this, and there is no perfect solution. So we have this spectrum with going to solutions like WorldCoin that definitely have uniqueness of humanity proved. But even in that case, they were situations where people were selling the scans on the black market, and so a system like this can be attacked. And as the technology progresses and humanity progresses, there are new ways to try to attack the system, being a machine, trying to show that actually human. So I think there are always going to be a certain percentage of false positive or false negatives. But when we talk about national IDs or KYC, I do believe that ZK technology can play a significant role in this. And there are a number of projects that experiment with this, allowing you to use your national ID to prove your identity without revealing personal information to a third party. I think one of the main challenges is in education and visualization of this process, because once an application asks a human to pull out their identity and show it to the device, they automatically think this information will go and stay in some third-party server, which is not necessarily true for the ZK systems, where the processing happens on your machine and doesn't go to a server, is not stored on third party. So we need to find a way not only to solve the technical part, but also to communicate to people that you're not actually revealing anything to the third party, and you're not going to be a victim of a hack of a server 2 years from now.
Yeah. But my intuition is that the answer will be through the crypto adoption curve, because the crypto folks will understand and start to adopt whatever ZK ID system emerges to solve a number of identity issues, and then that will create a network effect.
Yeah, another interesting research area is like web of trust and social circles. And there are ways to prove that you are part of a certain group in the past using both the blockchain and ZK technologies. And I know also a number of projects that try to solve this problem. And I'm actually quite optimistic on this solutions long term and national ID solutions short term.
Yeah, I agree with that, because it also supports the proof of humanity aspect of this.
I think it proves that you are integrated in a certain community, and there's always a way for other members of the community to attest to who you are, and that you're not actually a bot, that you're human, that you went to a certain university, went to a certain school, was part of this company or that company, and that all combined and owned by one entity but connected to other entities creates this network effects where people not necessarily need to rely on centralized authorities.
Yeah, and ideally whoever figures that out will be also working on the social recovery process, because those are going to be the same communities, and then kind of like on-chain reputation that can be, advantaging people that may not start from an economic resource base to participate in all these DeFi protocols and so forth. Yeah, interesting. Okay, so I know you're working on Octant 2.0. Take us through what's next.
Yeah, that's the part I'm most excited about.
No doubt.
Since we launched Octant V1, we have been thinking about how do we expand this model, because essentially we proved it worked. There's a stream that funds projects. The number of projects we can fund is limited. The amount of funds we can give away is limited. And what we've done, essentially, we used proof of stake mechanism in Ethereum as a source of funding. So we started looking into other ways to fund public goods and other streams of funding. So we started tapping into so-called liquid staking protocols, DeFi protocols, layers 2 that generate fees in the same way proof of stake generates rewards, and thinking, how do we create a holistic pipeline that both rewards individuals but also funds public goods? And so the code name for Octant V2 is Degens and Dragons. And so where it's coming from is we have this metaphor that a dragon is this creature that sits on a pile of gold. And when they sit on a pile of gold, they don't want to get up from that pile of gold. And so looking at Golden Foundation, we took this pile of gold and put it to work. And so the same way we did it, we think other projects, other dragons can do the same. They can both keep having their treasury without giving it away, but start creating more and more sustainable revenue streams. And we also understand that a lot of folks in the crypto space are more connected to financial goals, right? And there's this term called degens and degen behavior, where people bet on things, where people invest, put money into meme coins. And although there are different opinions about these groups of people, they form a big community of Ethereum and other crypto networks. And when we think about it, we understand that this is actually a response to economic systemic challenges that young people are in. And if we look at the real estate distribution over time, we can see that the percentage of real estate or wealth owned by younger generations is much smaller than it was at the same age for previous generations.
Right.
And because we face all these economic challenges and other challenges in the modern times, young people think, how do I make it? How do I start a family? How do I buy a house? And many people turn to crypto to make a bet. They think, I'm going to bet $10,000, $100,000 in this project and try to make 25x, because logically, I don't really have a way to buy a house in the next 15 years if I'm going to work on a salary. So it actually might seem like a logical choice. And so we think we need to understand these groups of people. And so combining the Degens and Dragons energy and capital, we can create a system that replicates Octant model, but also creates a sustainable pool inside of this. So what I mean by this, when we invite other dragons, other projects, they can fund their community, their own network. Like we were talking about network goods, if it's a layer 2 running on Ethereum, they can focus part of this yield that is generated from their capital on funding their community. But in the middle of the system of the protocol we're building, we have something we call sustainability pool. And the idea of the sustainability pool is that every dragon contributes a part of that yield to that pool. And it can be used to fund all Ethereum public goods and projects that are really impactful for the larger ecosystem. And so because we have these tools with invention of Ethereum, we can create protocols that run automatically, enforced by decentralized computation and transparent to everybody, that can fund things at the larger scale.
Got it. So if I'm hearing you correctly, we're entering into a generation of potential financial nihilism because it's so out of reach even to just get, a house
Exactly.
these days. And Degens and Dragons essentially connects the dragons, which are the large projects that sit on big treasuries of gold, and the Degens, which would be the people who are staking, earning yield inside of these ecosystems, kind of like the Golem token holders who are staking their Golem tokens and earning yield. And for the dragons, you're essentially creating a meta on top of the Octant software tools to say, okay, this isn't just for the Golem Foundation. Now other DAOs can come do the same thing. They can create matching pools, fund network and public goods inside of their ecosystems, reward their token holders let their token holders do quadratic voting or other forms of capital allocation, presumably. But there will be a fee applied to all of this, a tax that we won't call a tax, like some sort of provision for all of these services and these tools, which goes into this shared pool, which is towards the larger Ethereum public goods space.
Yeah, exactly. And all of these communities, they essentially will have their own pool that we call Dragon Pool.
Hmm.
Have a lot of names with dragons, because we're really connected to this metaphor. And this Dragon Pool can use different allocation mechanisms. Does not necessarily need to use quadratic funding. The community can decide how they allocate the funds for a specific community. But essentially, yes, a part of this goes into the larger pool. But the idea is not like a fee that Golden Foundation takes. We create this permissionless protocol that is transparent, and everybody contributes to this pool. And then everybody collectively decides how this is going to be distributed, because the same users who can vote on a specific Dragon funding distribution for a specific community, they all have a voice on how this sustainability pool is going to be distributed. And so the fundamental question is how we all come together and create systems that work, that can fund impactful projects and public goods sustainably long term, but also benefit individuals. Because everybody in this ecosystem who actively plays a role, they will be able to earn rewards. And the people who actually care about public goods more will be rewarded more in the future. And we came up with a mechanism that potentially can solve this problem as well.
I'm going to share more on that.
Yeah, definitely. So we have the capital formation, we have the different capital allocation mechanisms with quadratic funding and other mechanisms. But the question also becomes, how do you incentivize people to vote? How do you incentivize people to participate? If you just pay people for voting, essentially say, you can only withdraw rewards if you vote, we break the incentives here, because we will not get the right signal from people.
Right.
People can say, okay, I'm going to vote for project 1, 2, 3 and take my money and go home.
Right.
And so what we're creating could be seen something like an impact prediction market. And so where we're saying that these dragons are going to put the money in the pool and fund 10 projects now, but also a part of the funding will be secured to pay for impact created in the future. But the way it's going to work is people who are going to decide now what project is going to be impactful in the future will get this funding secured for the future. And so what we're doing with this, we're essentially saying, project will receive $10 million now because they need funding now to create this impact. And then people who care about public goods and impact are going to go research the projects and vote for those who will create more impact in 3 months, in a year from now. But the key here is we create the demand for this impact. And the 10 years from now, there is going to be impact evaluation that will decide that, for example, $1 million will go to this funders because they were able to understand the value that these projects will produce in the future.
Right.
And so that's how we curate in the signal.
Got it. So what I hear you saying is that essentially the voters vote, quadratically or however the matching pool goes to the projects, but there's a little bit of money that goes into the future impact evaluation, retroactive rewards. And those who are correct, those who actually accurately predicted with their research and their funds which projects were going to create the most impact, they actually get some sort of recompensation.
Exactly. So we essentially combining prospective funding and retroactive funding in the one ecosystem. And we think that it's very hard to go from where we are to retroactive funding right away.
Totally.
So we need some kind of like pathway there.
Totally.
And we need to start funding those projects from the Dragons in the Web3 space, and then reward people who actually participate and care about public goods, and then reward them. But if you think about even further step forward, it can be double funded. So you can have double retroactive funding. So what I mean by this is once the Dragons fund the impact and then they reward people who were right, the Dragons now will have this certificate, this thing that I didn't mention, but there is a certificate that is given to people who vote now. It is given back to the Dragons when they buy it back, when they reward users. And now, for example, if we think about the larger scale, big philanthropy fund, nation state, and if we think really that retroactive funding narrative will pick up, this big nation state and philanthropic funds can go back and say, okay, you created extremely important solution for climate that saved the planet, and now we want to reward you back. But the system doesn't need to have that to work. Because Dragons are already dragon. They don't need more sustainability. It's just like an interesting extra piece that creates even more network effects in the future.
You have a talent for going meta. I love it. So I guess that gets to that. Returning back to when I said I want to dive into the two issues with the quadratic funding, and that second issue was the popularity contest issue. And then, it seems like the natural conclusion is impact evaluation is the way that we mitigate that and that we get at that, right? Like, so, we shouldn't just reward the projects that have the biggest social media following on Twitter and manage to shill their round, the loudest, and then become top of mind for someone. And then now all of a sudden they're the only ones that are being compensated with these grants programs. We want to look into these projects and actually understand the impact that they're having and reward the merit and the results and the actual on the ground work, even if they're not necessarily the best tweeters. And so that becomes a question of, well, what is the impact we're trying to get at, and how do we evaluate that, and how do we track that? And these are age-old problems, but now age-old problems that exist on chain and programmable money environments. And so, I guess that's the one piece of all of this we haven't really talked about is what is the impact evaluation, methodologies you're exploring, the tooling, and how are you thinking about that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we see two main problems in this space in terms of impact funding. One is the one that you mentioned, is impact evaluation. And the second is actually securing the funding to fund this impact. And they go in hand, right? If the capital is not sure that impact evaluation is going to be useful or accurate, people don't want to secure the funding. But with the mechanism design we're making, we're actually solving the demand side. We securing the funding for impact at some point in the future. And we're given the power to Dragons, potentially with the help of the community, to decide who's going to be rewarded. And so impact evaluation exists as a part of it, but also separate. So if you think about it, this model can exist without impact evaluation. The question, though, becomes how accurate the signal that is going to be. And we are very well connected in the public goods funding space, and we're working with different projects that try to solve this problem. And we want to attack this from different points of view and working with different other projects of how they run impact evaluation. For example, for climate, it might be a little easier than for some other areas. And it requires...
That's what you think now.
Okay. let me rephrase that. We are working with a number of different projects that try to attack impact evaluation. And we think this is the part that is actually going to plug into the protocol. So we're not solving the impact evaluation problem on its own. We're securing the funding, we're securing the demand side, and we're working with other projects to try and experiment with different models
Mm-hmm.
and see what will work for different use cases.
Mm-hmm.
Because this model can work both for the sustainability pool that funds Ethereum public goods, but it can also work for a specific community.
Mm-hmm.
And specific community can be interested in many different things.
Right.
And if a specific community is interested in funding climate,
Mm-hmm.
that's one set of metrics. If a specific community is interested in funding open source software, it's a different set of metrics,
Mm-hmm.
which means we need different models that will signal what was important. And because this is a massive experiment, we don't know how accurate this is going to be, but I'm convinced that we need to run more bold experiments at scale and see where they succeed and where they fail,
Mm-hmm.
because an experiment run with $10,000 is different than experiment run with $10 million.
Yep.
And they can lead to different outcome. So I don't think like anybody solved the impact evaluation problem until now. Neither did we. And we rely on partners in different projects to feed this into this Dragons that will be able to actually vote. Because this is the interplay between different incentives. And you need to find a balance between the Dragons, between the Degens, between the people who actually try to find the best way to evaluate impact. And some people in this space told me that like we want to run this impact evaluation program, but nobody wants to pay it for this. And we don't have way to sustain ourselves. So this funding both can be used to fund projects who know or think they know how to evaluate impact, but also reward people who make a bet on the impact. And so by securing the funding, by actually creating this pool, we are trying to create the flywheel and we see where it goes.
Yeah. Yeah. Very similar conclusions we're coming to. I mean, we are excited about hypercerts. I think some of the key principles for us is like inheriting the open nature of blockchains to make this an open evaluation system, so that right now in the ecological space, a lot of impact tracking really just amounts to opaque carbon credit systems in different silos, which are like so many problems: top down, opaque, different, not always aligned incentives, carbon tunnel vision, one size fits all, but ecological things on the ground actually need to look differently. So, you want to democratize and open that up so that even if you are plugging in a traditional carbon credit system, someone can attest and say, actually, that was really terrible for the biodiversity here, or no, actually, that was great in all these other ways that should also be compensated and rewarded. So open evaluation was one. And then another is exactly the problem you're talking about, which is what is the funding for the evaluation? And the way that the hypercerts primitive works is that essentially you can attach some portion of the tradability of the cert itself to be in compensation to the evaluators. So, if $1 was traded for that impact, 10 cents can go to the evaluation. Now you start that flywheel, which in the environmental space is notoriously tricky. How do you compensate environmental data collection? We want armies of citizen scientists, attesting what's happening geographically and ecologically in their environments. But right now, they don't have any mechanism for getting paid for that.
Yeah, exactly. And for us, there's like this two streams of funding that need to come from this capital to work. And one goes to reward those who vote now, right? We want to somehow incentivize participation.
Yep.
And another goes to impact evaluation. And if you think about this, if this projects, these Dragons, they're actually interested in creating impact in their community, they're actually motivated to fund projects and people who reliably gonna measure impact and provide them with the information to be able to reward those who came in the first place. So they want curation in their community. They want people who actually care about the community, and then can be applied at different scales.
Yeah. Yeah, you're making me think more about that incentive to vote and participate. I was thinking of it more at like the reputation layer and the social signaling layer. And like, you have your beautiful dashboard of impact portfolio and you have your certificates that you're accruing. But actually putting some substantive incentives financially as well is interesting.
Yeah, and if we're really honest about it, people at large don't care about impact now.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also related to how the political and social system works in general, because we live in the times of capitalism. And most people are financially driven, profit driven, don't necessarily think about impact. And although we understand there are a lot of different vectors where world can go wrong. There are potential catastrophe vectors. There are wars that are happening in the world. There's climate issues. There are all other kind of vectors that we need to address. Even if we talk about COVID, like a couple years from now, people don't really care much about the health system, although there was a massive event. And so we need to find better ways to speak with people the same language. And there is no way around it than just to tap into some capitalistic mindset and start plugging the things that are important for humanity, important for uh, other people, not necessarily focusing on individual goals, because actually that will help those individuals prosper in the future.
Yeah, love it. I could geek out with you all day on this stuff, Artem. Really enjoyed this conversation. Any final messages, words you want to share? How do people get involved and plug into it?
Feel free to join our community. You can find Octant at octant.app. We're really excited about Octant V2. So if you're connected to the message of Degens and Dragons, join our Discord. We will be developing this narrative in the future. Octant's mission is to create the first global self-sustaining ecosystem that both balances public goods funding and personal financial empowerment. So we believe that we need to both reward individuals and public goods projects. So if you feel connected to this message, if you like the narrative about Degens and Dragons, feel free to join our community, join Twitter, Discord, come to Octant app and start participating in voting and earning rewards. And we are on the journey to fund more and more Ethereum public goods. So we want to create a sustainable system for generations and then go beyond Ethereum and Web3.
Awesome. Artem, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, Matthew.
The future is being invented before our eyes. I hope you enjoyed that conversation. Lots of other related discussions to this one. But to learn more, go to octant.app. We are here at DevCon in Bangkok 2024. For more on grants programs, you might want to check out the recent conversation we had with Kevin Owocki at Gitcoin. We're talking to Metrics Garden. We're talking to Karma Gap, Cello Public Goods. Also, if you're interested in kind of this philanthropic on-chain donation space, you might want to check out the discussion we had with Robbie Heeger at Endowment. If you want to look into more of the 2.0 philanthropic DAF space, there's also a good discussion with Alex Gear from Daffy, including this kind of social signaling campaigns related to philanthropy. So many of these topics are covered in a variety of conversations that you can find at maearth.com. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.